So hello everyone, this is CA Sanidhya Saraf, your friend, mentor and coach for audit and law. So in this very video, we are going to revise that is Asset 230, that is the standard on audit documentation. Right. Now, if we talk about Asset 230, that is the standard on audit documentation, again, it is a very, very important standard, a fundamental standard that emphasizes on the importance of documentation. Right, that during the audit process, we need to document everything. We need to document all the audit procedures that we have performed. We need to document all the evidences we have obtained, and we need to document all the conclusions that we have found. Basically, in this various standards, the important topics that you need to know is, first of all, meaning of audit documentation. Right. Secondly, you need to know the topic of ownership, retention, and sharing. कि working papers के मालिक कौन है? Who is the owner? Then for how much time the working papers are to be retained, and can the working papers be shared with the third parties and the client. The third topic that you need to remember is significance of documentation. Significance of documentation, what is the importance of documentation? And the fourth topic that you need to remember is what are the factors affecting form, content and extent of audit documentation. So these four things you need to know. Right. So talking about the first topic, that is meaning of audit documentation, it is very simple. Basically, audit documentation is nothing but the record of all the audit procedures that the auditor has performed, the relevant audit evidences that is raised upon by the auditor, and the conclusions that is formed by the auditor, and that is what we call as audit documentation. The second topic that you need to know is ownership, retention and sharing. So when we talk about ownership, तो ओनरशिप वर्किंग पेपर किसकी प्रॉपर्टी है? तो इट इज द प्रॉपर्टी ऑफ द ऑडिटर, इट इज द प्रॉपर्टी ऑफ द ऑडिटर. सेकेंडली रिटेंशन, डू रिमेंबर वर्किंग पेपर्स आर टू बी रिटेन्ड फॉर ए मिनिमम पीरियड ऑफ 7 years, for a minimum period of 7 years. And third is the topic of sharing. Now do remember, working papers contains certain confidential information regarding the client. And that is why the working papers cannot be shared with third party, right? Working papers cannot be shared with third party because that violates the basic fundamental of confidentiality that is also given in Asset 200. But the extract of working paper can be shared with the client if the auditor feels that, okay boss, my disclosure is not going to undermine the validity of my audit procedures performed. If the auditor feels such, then he can just share the extract of working papers with the client. The next topic that you need to remember is significance of documentation. What is the significance of documentation? So first of all, you see there is mandatory documentation requirement as per the law, as per certain standards, right? So because of the mandatory requirements, you need to do the documentation. So one of the advantages, it is going to enable the conduct of quality control review and inspections. That is the mandatory requirement of law. It is going to enable conduct of external inspections in accordance with legal requirement. That suppose, an external investigation takes place and external inspection takes place, then the working paper also needs to be shared. Then the second significance is, the second advantage is that it is going to assist the documentation that we do. It is going to assist the engagement team in planning and performing the audit. At the same time, it is going to assist the members of the engagement team, and they are going to be responsible to supervise the audit work, The next significance is that it is a retention of records. Documentation is a retention of records of matters. Documentation is a retention of records of matters of continuing significance for future audits. So that is one of the significance. The last important topic that you need to remember in this standard is what are the factors affecting form, content and extent of documentation. कि मैं कितना डॉक्यूमेंटेशन करूं, वो कौन से फैक्टर्स पे डिपेंड करेगा, राइट? तो वन ऑफ द इंपॉर्टेंट फैक्टर इज इट डिपेंड्स अपॉन द एंटिटी, द साइज ऑफ द एंटिटी, right? The size of the entity कितना बड़ा है, the nature of operations carried on by the entity, whether it's a section 8 entity or it's a commercial entity, it's a banking company, it's a normal company. So it depends upon the size and complexity of the entity. It depends upon the nature of business activities of the entity. It depends upon what are the nature of audit procedures we are going to perform. And also it depends upon the risk identified. मैंने audit procedures perform करा, मैंने कैसा risk identify करा. So it depends upon the nature of audit procedures to be performed. At the same time, it depends upon the risk identified. Now, once we have performed the audit procedures, it also depends upon what is the exceptions identified. So the risk identified, the exceptions identified. The nature of audit procedures, the size and complexity of the entity, right? the audit methodology that we are using, the significance of evidence that we are obtaining, the need to document a conclusion. So there are several factors that is going to affect the form, content and extent of documentation. So these are the important points, the most important points that you need to remember in this very standard. And do remember, SA 230 can further be interlinked with SQC. Then it can further be interlinked with SA 200 as well. Right? So this is all that you need to remember in SA 230, that is the standard of audit documentation.